One winter's evening, a young medical practitioner recently established in business was seated by a cheerful fire in his little parlour. He was listening to the wind, which was beating the rain in pattering drops against the window or rumbling dismally in the chimney. The night was wet and cold. He walked through mud and water the whole day and was now comfortably relaxing. More than half asleep, less than half awake, as 1,000 matters revolved in his wandering imagination. First, he thought about how hard the wind was blowing and how the cold, sharp rain would be at that moment, beating in his face if he wasn't at home. Then his mind reverted to his annual Christmas visit to his native place and dearest friends. He thought about how glad they would all be to see him, and how happy it would make Rose if he could tell her that he had finally found a patient and hoped to have more, and wanted to come down again in a few months' time to marry her and take her home to his lonely fireside. Then he began to wonder when his first patient would appear, or whether he was destined to never have any patients at all. And then he thought about Rose again before falling asleep, and dreaming about her until her sweet voice sounded in his ears, and her soft tiny hand rested on his shoulder. There was a hand on his shoulder, but it was neither soft nor tiny, its owner being a heavy, round-headed boy who carries medicine and messages for weekly money and food. As there was no demand for the medicine and no necessity for the messages, he usually occupied his unemployed hours, which was about 14 a day, eating peppermint drops and sleeping. The boy woke his master with a shake and told him that there was a lady present.
What lady? What lady? Where at?
He wasn't certain if his dream was an illusion. He was half expecting that it might be Rose herself. The boy pointed to the office's glass door with an alarmed look, the kind you'd expect to see from a customer, which was a rare sight. The surgeon looked towards the door and was momentarily taken aback by the sight of his unexpected visitor. It was a tall woman dressed in black. She was standing so close to the door that her face almost touched the glass. Her upper body was carefully covered in a black shawl, and her face was shrouded by a thick black veil. She stood perfectly straight with her body stretched to its full height. The surgeon sensed that her eyes, which were hidden beneath the veil, were focused on him. She remained motionless and showed no sign of awareness that he looked her way.
Do you need to see me?
The surgeon hesitantly asked as he held the door open. Since the door opened inward, it didn't change the position of the figure. She remained motionless where she stood. She slightly inclined her head to indicate yes, and the surgeon said to come inside. The figure took a step forward, then turned her head towards the boy, which terrified him greatly.
Leave the room, Tom. Close the curtain and shut the door.
The surgeon told the boy, who had been staring wide-eyed throughout this short interaction. The boy closed the green curtain across the glass part of the door and left the room, closing the door after him, only to immediately put his large eyes to the keyhole on the other side. The surgeon pulled a chair up to the fire and motioned the visitor to sit, and the mysterious figure slowly moved towards it. As the firelight illuminated her black dress, the surgeon noticed that the bottom was soaked with mud and rain.
You're very wet. Are you ill?
I am very ill, but it's not physical, it's mental. I didn't come here for myself or on my own behalf. If I was suffering from a physical illness, I wouldn't be out here alone at such an hour on a night like this. And if I were physically ill, God knows how eagerly I would lie down and pray to die. It's for someone else that I'm begging for your help. I might be mad to ask it for him. I actually think I am. But night after night, through the long, dreary hours of watching and weeping, this thought has constantly haunted me. And even though I see the hopelessness, the mere idea of burying him without trying, it chills me to the bone.
And with that, she shuddered, a shudder so genuine the surgeon knew that no one could fake it. There was a desperate sincerity in this woman's manner that went to the young man's heart. Being relatively new to his profession, he hadn't yet become desensitized to human suffering, as many in his field eventually do.
If the person you're describing is in such a hopeless condition that you describe, not a moment is to be lost. I will go with you immediately. Why did you not seek medical advice before?
Because it would have been pointless before, and it's still pointless now.
He stared at the thick black veil covering her face to discern any expression beneath, but it was impenetrable.
Even if you don't realize it, you're sick. The fever that has let you endure this ordeal without feeling its strain is still burning within you. Drink this water and calm down for a moment, and then tell me about the patient's condition and how long he's been sick. Once I know what's necessary, I'll be ready to go with you.
The stranger lifted the glass of water to her mouth without raising the veil, and put it down without tasting, then shed tears.
I know that what I say to you now seems like the ravings of fever. I have been told so before. I'm not young anymore, and they say that as life nears its end, the last few years might seem insignificant, but they're very precious to the person living them. I would gladly give up these remaining years, with cheerfulness, with joy, if only what I'm telling you now was not true. By tomorrow morning, the person I'm speaking of will be far beyond helping, despite my hopes, and tonight, even though he's in grave danger, you cannot see him or help him.
I don't want to cause you more stress by making any comments, or appearing overly eager to discuss a subject that makes you anxious. But there is an inconsistency in your statement that I can't understand. This person is dying tonight, but I can't see him even though I'm available. You say it will be useless tomorrow, so why wouldn't you have me see him if he's as dear to you as you say? Why not try to save his life and delay the progress of his disease?
God help me. How can I hope strangers will believe what appears unbelievable even to myself? Will you not see him then, sir?
I didn't say that I won't see him, but I warn you that if you keep delaying this and the individual dies, a fearful responsibility rests with you.
The responsibility will rest heavily somewhere. Whatever responsibility rests with me, I'm content to bear it and ready to answer for it.
I risk none by agreeing to your request. I will see him in the morning if you leave me the address. And you must excuse my pressing questions, but when can he be seen? And is he under your care?
You can see him at 9 and no, he isn't under my care.
If I give you instructions for his treatment for the night, can you assist him?
She shook her head no, and the surgeon realized there was little chance of obtaining more information by prolonging the interview. Anxious to spare the woman's feelings, the surgeon repeated his promise of calling in the morning at the appointed hour. His visitor gave him directions to an obscure part of Walworth and left the house in the same mysterious manner in which she had entered it. Such an extraordinary visit produced a considerable impression on the mind of the young surgeon. He spent a lot of time pondering the potential details of the case, but couldn't come up with any concrete conclusions. Like many others, he was familiar with extraordinary stories where people had a premonition of their death happening on a specific day or even at a specific time. And those premonitions actually came true. For a moment, the surgeon thought this might be a case of someone having a premonition about their own death, as he had heard in those stories. However, those stories always involved individuals who sensed their own end, whereas this woman was concerned about another person, a man. It seemed highly unlikely that a mere dream or imaginative delusion would lead her to speak with such conviction about his impending death. He wondered, could it be possible that the man was scheduled to be murdered the next morning, and that the woman, initially complicit and sworn to secrecy, had changed her mind? Even though she couldn't stop whatever harm was planned, perhaps she was trying to prevent his death by seeking medical help in time. But the idea of such a scenario unfolding so close to the heart of the city seemed too absurd to consider seriously for long. Then, his original impression that the woman's intellects were disordered and recurring. As it was the only mode of solving the difficulty with any degree of satisfaction, he made up his mind. He decided to believe that she was mad. Certain misgivings up to this point took over his thoughts and presented themselves again and again through the long, dull course of a sleepless night. In spite of all his efforts, he was unable to banish the black veil from his disturbed imagination. The back part of Walworth is a straggling, miserable place even in these days. But years ago, the greater portion of it was little better than a dreary waste inhabited by a few scattered people of questionable character, whose poverty prevented them from living in better neighbourhoods or pursuing a better life. Many of the houses, which have since sprung up on all sides, were not built until some years afterward, and the great majority of people there, even those who were sprinkled about at irregular intervals, were of the rudest and most miserable. The appearance of the place through which he walked in the morning didn't raise the spirits of the young surgeon or dispel any feeling of anxiety or depression about the kind of visit he was about to make. It continued off the main road across a marshy common with irregular lanes. He saw ruins of dismantled cottages falling to pieces with decay and neglect. He saw stunted trees and or pools of stagnant water, roused only by the heavy rain from the night before. He skirted the path occasionally and saw an occasional miserable patch of garden ground with a few old boards knocked together for a summer house and old palings imperfectly mended with stakes from the neighbouring hedges. They bore testimony to the poverty of the inhabitants and the little scruple they entertained in appropriating the property of other people to their own use. Occasionally a filthy-looking woman would make her appearance from the door of a dirty house to empty the contents of some cooking utensil into the gutter in front, or to scream after a little slipshod girl who had managed to stagger a few yards from the door under the weight of a sallow infant almost as big as herself. But nothing was stirring around otherwise, and so much of the prospect as could be faintly traced through the cold damp mist which hung heavily over it presented a lonely and dreary appearance perfectly in keeping with the objects we have described. After plodding warily through the mud, making many inquiries for the place to which he had been directed, and receiving as many contradictory and unsatisfactory replies in return, the young man finally arrived at the house. It was a small, low building 1-story above the ground, with a more desolate and unpromising exterior than any he had yet passed. An old yellow curtain was closely drawn across the window upstairs, and the parlour shutters were closed, but not fastened. The house was detached from any other, as it stood at an angle of a narrow lane. There was no other habitation in sight. The surgeon hesitated and walked past the house a few times before he could bring himself to knock on the door. It's not a detail that should seem amusing or trivial, even to the bravest readers. Back then, the police force in London wasn't as effective as it might be today, and the suburbs were still quite isolated, unlike the continuously expanding urban landscape of later years. This isolation made these areas, especially the one the surgeon was visiting, a haven for some of the most dangerous and depraved individuals. Even the streets in the better parts of London were imperfectly lighted at that time, and such places as these were left entirely to the mercy of the moon and stars. The chances of detecting desperate characters or of tracing them to their haunts were very slim, and their offences naturally increased in boldness as more security became impressed upon them daily. Added to these considerations, it must be remembered that the young man had spent some time in the public hospitals of the metropolis. And although neither Burke nor Bishop had gained horrible notoriety, his own observation might have suggested how easily the atrocities might be committed. Be this as it may, whatever reflection made him hesitate, he did hesitate. But being a young man of strong mind and great personal courage, it was only for an instant. He briskly walked back and knocked gently at the door. A low whispering was audible immediately afterward, as if some person at the end of the passage were conversing stealthily with another on the landing above. It was followed by the noise of a pair of heavy boots on the bare floor. The door chain was softly unfastened, and the door opened, and a tall, ill-looking man with black hair and a face as pale and haggard as a dead man answered,
"Walk in, sir."
The surgeon did so, and the man secured the door by the chain and led the way to a small back parlour.
Did I make it here in time?
Too soon. If you'll step in here, you won't be waiting more than 5 minutes.
The surgeon walked into the room, and the man closed the door and left him alone. It was a little cold room furnished with nothing more than 2 chairs and a table. A meagre fire burned, but did little more than highlight the room's dampness. It barely warmed the space, but it made the walls sweat with unwholesome moisture, which ran down them in long slug-like trails. The window, cracked and patched in several places, overlooked a tiny yard nearly flooded with water. The house, both inside and out, was completely silent. The young surgeon sat down by the fireplace waiting to see what would come of his first professional visit. It was only a few minutes when the noise of some approaching vehicle struck his ear. It stopped. The street door was opened. A low talking succeeded, accompanied with a shuffling noise of footsteps along the passage, and on the stairs, as if 2 or 3 men were engaged in carrying some heavy body to the room above. The creaking of the stairs a few seconds afterward indicated that the newcomers having completed their task, whatever it was, and they were leaving the house. The door was again closed, and the silence was restored. Another 5 minutes passed, and the surgeon decided to explore the house in search of someone to whom he might speak to about this visit. Then the door opened, and last night's visitor, dressed in exactly the same manner, with the veil lowered just as before. She motioned him to enter. Her height, coupled with the circumstance of her not speaking, caused the idea to pass across his brain for an instant that it might be a man disguised in a woman's attire. The hysteric sobs that issued from beneath the veil and the convulsive attitude of grief of the whole figure exposed the absurdity of his suspicion, and he hastily followed. The woman led the way upstairs to the front room and paused at the door to let him in first. It was scantily furnished with an old deal box, a few chairs, and a tented bed without hangings or cross rails. The dim light admitted through the curtain, which he had noticed from the outside, rendered the objects in the room so indistinct that he didn't initially see the object he was looking at when the woman rushed frantically past him and flung herself on her knees by the bedside. Stretched upon the bed, closely enveloped in a linen wrapper and covered with blankets, lay a human body, stiff and motionless. The head and face were uncovered except for a bandage that passed over the head and under the chin. The eyes were closed. The left arm lay heavily across the bed, and the woman held the passive hand. The surgeon gently pushed the woman aside and took the hand in his.
Oh my God, this man is dead.
The woman started to her feet and beat her hands together.
Don't say that. Don't say that. I can't bear it. Men have been brought to life before when people have given up on them, and men have died who might have been restored if proper means had been resorted to. Don't let him lie here without one effort to save him. This very life may be passing away. For heaven's sake, please try.
While speaking, she hurriedly rubbed the man's forehead and then his chest. She wildly beat his cold hands, and when she stopped holding them, it fell listlessly and heavily back on the bed.
It's of no use. Wait! Undraw that curtain. Undraw the curtain now.
I darkened the room on purpose. Have pity on me. If it can be of no use and he's really dead, don't expose that form to other eyes than mine.
This man died no natural or easy death. I must see the body.
With emotion so sudden the woman hardly knew that he had slipped from beside her, he tore open the curtain and returned to the bedside.
There has been violence here.
He pointed towards the body, gazing intently on the face from which the black veil was now, for the first time, removed. In the excitement of a minute before, the woman had thrown off the veil and stood with her eyes fixed upon him. Her features were those of a woman about 50 who had once been attractive. Sorrow and weeping had left traces upon them that time itself wouldn't ever have produced without their aid. Her face was deadly pale, and there was a nervous contortion of her lip and an unnatural fire in her eyes, which showed too plainly that her bodily and mental powers had nearly sunk beneath an accumulation of misery.
There has been violence here. This man was murdered.
I call God to witness he has, pitilessly, inhumanly murdered.
Who murdered him?
Look at the marks, and then ask me.
The surgeon turned his face towards the bed and bent over the body, which now lay completely in the light of the window. The throat was swollen, and a mark encircled it. The truth flashed suddenly upon him. This is one of the men who were hanged this morning.
Who was this man?
He was my son.
It was true. A partner in crime, equally guilty, had been acquitted due to lack of evidence, leaving this man to face execution alone. Detailing the events, now so many years later, is unnecessary and could cause distress to some who are still living. The story was a common one. The mother was a widow without friends or resources. She sacrificed her own needs to support her son. Yet, despite her sacrifices and prayers, the boy ignored her suffering, both her constant mental anguish and physical deprivation, and spiraled into a life of reckless behavior and crime. And this was the result: his own death by the hangman's hands, and his mother's shame and incurable insanity. For many years following this tragic occurrence, even as his successful and demanding career could have led many men to forget her existence, the young surgeon was a daily visitor at the side of the harmless mad woman. He not only comforted her with his presence and kindness, but also lessened the harshness of her life with generous financial support. In the fleeting moments of clarity before her death, she offered a prayer for his welfare and protection with as much passion as any human could muster. That prayer flew to heaven and was heard. The blessings he provided were returned to him 1,000-fold. Yet, despite all the honors and achievements he later earned, none would ever touch his heart as deeply as his experiences with the Black Veil. Thank you so much for listening, and please subscribe for more.